Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Fox Williams. My name, for those of you who don't know me, is Steve Stuart. I'm one of the partners of Fox Williams, and it is my privilege to lead our agentlaw team. Thank you for coming along this evening. Thank you also to those of you who are aware of coming along, having been to Stone last November, where the RMT decided to do one of its on-off strikes. Their first work is on the 9th of November, where we should have been affording this event, and then it was off. But by that time, it was too late. A couple of points of housekeeping, and then I shall run you through the agenda. We are not expecting any fire drills this evening. We had actually our last fire drill to the whole building. It was vigil, 30 week before, certainly it's been this month. But we're not expecting anything this evening. If something does happen, then we will provide you to the nearest available exit. As a courtesy to others in the room and to our speakers, please do, if you have mobile devices or anything that's likely to make noise, please put the silent or airplane mode in order that others are not disturbed. In terms of our agenda for this evening, it's on your screen now. So our first speaker this evening is my colleague Millie Pierce. Millie's going to be talking about the applicability of non-compete restrictions on distributors and AGs, following a couple of recent decisions of, if I recall correctly, and Millie even correct me if I've got it wrong, the Court of Appeals. Oh, got that right. Excellent. But it's going to be followed by my partner, Evie Meliagros. Evie is going to be talking about bribery and fraud. That is not to say that we are going to engage in bribing any of you this evening, or inviting you to commit fraud. But the fact of the matter is that instances of bribery and fraud do occur so far as agents and distributors are concerned. It's not something that is of a particularly recent phenomenon, though there are a number of recent cases, one of which has been in the press this month involving Revolution Beauty, where a report has been, an investigation has been undertaken, a report has been published by the investigators, and that shows that the directors of Revolution Beauty were engaged in certain activities which arguably they should not have been engaged in. In any event, Evie will be talking about what can and should be done in terms of spotting it, preventing it, and tackling it. Our guest speaker this evening is Stuart Burns from the accountants H.W. Fisher. Stuart's going to be looking at the calculation of compensation for the purposes of the commercial agents regulations, following things such as Brexit, for those of you who recall Brexit, COVID, ditto, and what is unfortunately continuing, namely the war in Ukraine. And lastly, my colleague Jess Howard is going to be talking about selling online, the issues for suppliers and distributors and principals and agents. The issues affecting businesses today, so far as principals and suppliers, agents and distributors are concerned, are many. They're complex. We live in, I think, in an increasingly complex world, not least because of various things that have happened to us over the course of, let's say, the last 7 years, going back to the 23rd of June, 2016. And as I was remarking when we were having the pre-seminar drinks in the other room, even in the last few months, there have been two decisions of the European Court sitting in Luxembourg, which have caused us as lawyers to have to think through the situation in terms of the judgments of that court, in terms of, okay, so how does that affect principals in the UK? How does that affect agents in the UK when their counterparties are in the EU? And irrespective of that, how does that affect principal and agent when they're both in the UK? It's a complex area, and I suspect it is only going to become more complex as we go along. But without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Millie to talk about the enforceability of non-compete restrictions on distributors and agents. If you do have questions, please do keep them in your mind, and when all of our speakers finish, we'll then do a Q&A before adjourning across the corridor for some drinks, for some canapes, and some informal conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Steve. I hope everyone can hear me, but please do let me know if you can't. So as Steve mentioned, my name is Millie. I'm an associate in the Commerce and Technology Department here at Fox Williams, as well as being a member of our agent law team. Again, as Steve mentioned, today I will be talking to you about the topic of non-compete restrictions and their enforceability following two recent decisions of the English Court of Appeal. First of all, to start off with, what is a non-compete restriction? Well, you may often hear these referred to as a restraint of trade provision, or perhaps a restrictive covenant. Essentially, it is a restriction imposed in a contract which has the purpose of preventing a party from a certain action that could be in competition with the party imposing the provision. Typically, they are imposed by the principal or supplier on the agent or distributor. Examples that you will often see are clauses restricting an agent for acting for a competitor to the principal, for example, for 6 months after termination of the agency. They can also exist during the course of the agency or distribution contract, for example, to prevent an agent for acting for other competing principals. Something to note when including these types of clauses is that they must be reasonable. But what does reasonable really mean? Previously, clauses of this kind were said to be reasonable if they protected a legitimate business interest. But this has now changed for post-termination non-compete restrictions. But why is this relevant right now? Well, there were two key court judgments in June 2022, the case of Credico Marketing Limited and Lambert, and Dwyer and Fredvar, which concerned an agency and a franchise agreement, respectively. These provided key changes to the way that non-compete restrictions are viewed in agency and franchise contracts. I'll provide a brief overview of each of these cases and explain why the changes in the law are relevant to agents and distributors today. So firstly, Credico and Lambert. This case concerned a marketing company which engaged a series of agents to provide face-to-face marketing services for its customers under agreements they called trading agreements. Their agents worked door-to-door and each operated their own network of self-employed sales representatives. When an agent joined Credico, they were each given specialist training on their role. Each agency agreement or trading agreement contained two non-compete provisions. The first was enforced during the contract, that the agent must not engage in similar work for anyone else during the course of the agency. The second came into force post-termination of the agency, that the agent was not allowed to engage in similar work for anyone else within a 10-mile radius of Credico for 6 months following termination of the agency. One of Credico's agents, a Mr. Lambert, acted in breach of the second non-compete after his agency was terminated, and Credico issued a claim against him. Credico argues that the post-termination restriction was both necessary and reasonable because of the confidential information they had provided to their agents, the time spent training the agents, and the money spent assisting the agents in order for them to become profitable and successful. The Court of Appeal disagreed. But why? Well, in respect to the first non-compete provision, the one in place during the agency, the court found that this restriction was reasonable and enforceable as it engaged the doctrine of restraint of trade. The court found that the purpose of this clause was to protect Credico's investment in both money and resources by providing it with an exclusive pool of agents. However, for the post-termination restriction, they needed to look at whether the restraint of trade was reasonable in all of the circumstances, focusing on the test of whether Credico had a legitimate business interest to justify the restraint. The court ruled that the business support provided to the agents during the lifetime of the contract did not amount to a legitimate business interest that needed to be protected after the agreement ended. They also stated that the specialist training that Credico relied upon to enforce this non-compete was not sufficiently special to warrant granting a non-compete provision, and it was similar to the kind of training that would usually be given to employees during the course of employment without the same repercussions. The judge emphasised that the lack of a legitimate business interest was not the only factor that should be used to assess reasonableness in all the circumstances, but that the court also needed to focus on the inequality of bargaining power between the parties. The court went so far as to state that the post-termination restriction would have been upheld as enforceable if the parties had equality of bargaining power, but there was no such equality in this case. The concept of equality of bargaining power looks at the relative ability of each party in a contract in a negotiation. A key example of this concept is in a consumer contract, where a consumer is provided by a company, such as Apple when you sign up for an iPhone, with standard terms and conditions when setting up that cannot be negotiated. In that situation, the parties will be of unequal bargaining power. The next case to consider is that of Dwyer and Fredbar. This case concerned a franchise known as the Drain Doctor, who engaged franchisees to work in the drainage and plumbing industry. Drain Doctor had assessed a Mr. Bartlett, who was an individual who wanted to run his own franchise. Mr. Bartlett had no previous experience in the industry or as a franchisee, and the franchise was going to be his sole source of income after leaving his current employment and taking out a loan in order to pursue it. Starting a franchise was, as you can imagine, in the circumstances, a big financial risk for Mr. Bartlett. When he decided to proceed, he was sent a 100-page standard franchise agreement to sign. He did not review it in its entirety. Upon induction at Drain Doctor employees made internal notes that they weren't sure that Mr. Bartlett was the right fit. The judge in this case said it was at this point that Drain Doctor should have rejected Mr. Bartlett's application, but they went ahead anyway. Mr. Bartlett was then presented with their standard form agreement again. It stated that he should take legal advice, but he did not. The judge rejected that any improper pressure was received by Mr. Bartlett as to not taking legal advice. This agreement contained 2 non-compete restrictions. Both were in place for 1 year following termination of the franchise agreement. These were that the franchisee could not be engaged, concerned, or interested in a business similar to or competitive with the Drain Doctor business within the territory of the franchise, or within 5 miles of the territory of the franchise. Unsurprisingly, the business failed, not helped by the impact of COVID, and Mr. Bartlett tried to terminate the agreement. Following this, he then started a competing business called Daily Drains, around the same time as termination, prompting Drain Doctor to claim for breach of the non-compete restriction. But what did the Court of Appeal say? They said that the failure of the franchise was foreseeable, given all of the warning signs. They built on the points made in Credico that the inequality of bargaining power was key to the enforceability of the non-compete provisions. The judge said that inequality, where it exists, is not only relevant, but is the significant factor in determining reasonableness. This is a key turning point in how reasonableness is assessed, and is in contrast to previous judgments where a post-termination non-compete provision that lasted for 12 months or less and protected a legitimate business interest was deemed automatically enforceable. The previous position did not consider this issue of bargaining power. But what do these two cases mean for agency and franchise agreements? Well, as mentioned a moment ago, the key factor in deciding reasonableness in these cases was the inequality of bargaining power between the parties, which was not previously emphasised at all in the courts. Parties were given contractual autonomy. It is important to be aware that non-compete provisions that take effect during the course of an agreement are unaffected by this change. The test for reasonableness in these types of clauses remains: does the clause serve to protect a legitimate business interest? Despite this, the starting point as an agent is to always remember that an agent owes the common law duty of loyalty to their principal and the related fiduciary obligations. This is always important to bear in mind, even though the credit code judgments actually failed to consider the common law position. What could they mean for distribution agreements? Obviously, in these cases, distribution agreements were not considered. But the common law position for a distributor is that there is an implied duty of good faith owed between the supplier and the distributor. The duty of a distributor to a supplier could be seen as comparable to the fiduciary duty owed by an agent of principal that I mentioned a moment ago. As stated earlier, the credit code decision failed to consider the common law position, and this may be mirrored in the position for distributors if faced with a similar situation in the English courts. These are untested waters for distribution agreements, and at this point, if we are unsure whether Credico and Dwyer will be followed, but the decisions are important to note for distributors. It is also important to bear in mind the provisions of the VBEO, the Vertical Agreements Block Exemption Order, which Jessica will be talking about later on. If a non-compete obligation is indispensable to the supplier in order to protect the supplier's know-how, the clause may still be enforceable as a matter of competition law, even if it is not deemed to be reasonable. So what are the key take-home points that I'd like you to remember today? So firstly, the onus remains on the principal/franchisor/supplier to ensure that non-compete provisions that take effect during the course of an agreement are reasonable and do no more than is necessary to protect legitimate business interests. The tests of enforceability will differ for non-compete restrictions that take effect either during or after an agreement has ended. The provision of training and business support services provided by a supplier or a principal during the lifetime of an agreement will no longer automatically justify a post-termination non-compete provision. Instead, the issue will turn on equality of bargaining power between the parties. Any non-compete restrictions that are contained in precedent agreements should be checked and amended if needed following these two decisions. One final point of relevance for commercial agents that are covered by the commercial agency regulations is that non-compete restrictions for commercial agents will only be valid if they are in writing and if they relate to the geographical area or group of customers and the geographical area entrusted to the commercial agent and to the kind of goods covered by their agency under the contract. Thanks. And I will pause over. Thank you.
Thanks, Lily. So, as Steve mentioned, my name is Emma Abros. I am a partner in our dispute resolution team, which just means I'm a litigator. But we call it dispute resolution because other things happen under that umbrella. I specialise in civil fraud litigation, which might give away why I'm talking about that today. It probably sounds very scary and never going to happen to any of us in this room. You'd be surprised how often it happens. There is a huge body of case law in this area, which I'm not going to bore you with today, because we'll be here all day. So I'm just going to have a quick canter through what it looks like, what it might look like for you, how to spot it and prevent it, so you don't have to call me. I am also going to look at bribery, in particular civil bribery, because that is pretty. That is an area that's pretty prevalent, specifically in agency relationships. It's got its whole area that's designed purely to agency relationships. So we'll have a bit of a look at that as well. So bribery and fraud sounds all very scary. What does it actually mean? So obviously it's a criminal offence. I'm not a criminal lawyer, so I'm not going to go into any real detail, but the criminal implications are obviously going to touch on them slightly. It's also a civil law, which means that you can sue for it. It is the most common crime committed in England and Wales. According to recent statistics, it costs the UK economy £137 billion each year. Despite that, you'd probably be unsurprised to hear that in 2021, 0.8% of the total police force was focused on fraud, which means that we just don't have the resources on a police level to deal with it. And I don't know if anyone has dealt with the police in relation to a fraud matter, but they're not great at dealing with it. There, you may have heard of the NCA and the SFO. NCA is the National Crime Agency, the SFO is the Serious Fraud Office. Those guys deal with major organised crime. They deal with money laundering, Ponzi schemes, huge frauds that affect the average Joe or Jane, which are a public interest concern. They're not interested in the frauds that we see on the business scale, which can also be millions of pounds, but that's just something they don't have the resources to deal with. So that's why most people, when they are a victim of fraud, they turn to the civil route as opposed to the criminal route. Most people want their money back. They're not interested in putting people in prison. So in the civil context, in the civil context, what does fraud actually mean? Fraud is not a legal term. It's a term that we all understand, but it doesn't actually have a legally defined meaning. Fraud is an umbrella term which we refer to in the casual sense to refer to fraudulent activity. So under the umbrella fraud, you're looking at sort of legal actions like a deceit, conspiracy, conversion, breach of trust, dishonest assistance, fraudulent representation, misappropriation of funds, and all these are legal words that all mean someone has nicked something and I want it back. In a agent and principal relationship, what that usually looks like is false orders being placed, legitimate orders for goods that don't exist, data theft, often data theft in relation to agent or principal in order to elicit payments, false invoicing, push payment fraud, which might be a term you've heard of before. But push payment fraud is basically when you get a request to make a payment what on the face of it looks seemingly legitimate, but actually it's a fraud. So you transfer a payment, you instruct your bank to make a payment which you think is a legitimate payment, but it's not, and then the money disappears. Or you have someone internally who has made a payment which to the bank looks legitimate, but is not. And then there's difficulties around recovering that because the bank don't have a duty to investigate payment instructions. In a supply-distributor relationship, it might be theft of goods. You were simple making an order for some goods and then just not paying, disappearing. And the biggest fraud that we see is internal, it's employee frauds, and that's where most frauds happen. It's making these payments that are legitimate, etc. So that's the sort of stuff we see a day on varying scales. So what about bribery? I think we all know what a bribe is. The legal definition of a bribe is an offer, promise, or the giving of a financial or other advantage, and one intends the advantage to bring about an improper performance of a relevant function or activity by another person, or to reward such performance, or two, knows or believes that accepting the payment will in itself constitute the improper performance. It's obviously a criminal offence. There was the Bribery Act, which I nearly said was a recent act, but took 2010 was now quite a while ago. And a company which commits a bribery offence faces unlimited fine. An individual can go to prison and have a fine. But in civil bribery is a concept which is distinct to agency relationships. It essentially concerns with payments to agents without the principal's knowledge or consent. There are critical. My eyesight's so bad, I've realised that I'm actually struggling to see that one. For it to be a bribe, it needs to meet the critical components that are listed on the slide, and those critical components have to be an agency relationship. It needs to be a secret payment or inducement. It doesn't have to be money. It could be a non-monetary inducement. That secret payment has to give rise to a reasonable prospect of a conflict between the agent and the principal. The payment has to be made knowing that that person is an agent for the principal, and that knowledge has to be actual knowledge. It's not good enough to be constructive or assumed. You have to actually know that they are an agent, and the payment has to be a secret, so can't be disclosed to the principal. And if that criteria is met, then a secret commission can be classified as a bribe. And the beauty of that is there's these special rules that apply to that from a litigation perspective, which make it a lot easier to bring a claim. And those are also listed on the slide. And those components are, and those special rules are an irrebuttable presumption that the agent is influenced by the bribe. So if they argue that, no, I wasn't influenced, it's irrelevant, there is this automatic presumption that they were influenced. Motive is irrelevant. You don't have to show loss. It doesn't matter what the secret payment was for, and it doesn't matter if the bribed agent or bribed person didn't realise what he was doing, what he or she was doing was wrong. And if you establish a bribe, then the agent is automatically not entitled to any commission that's outstanding. If it doesn't meet the bribery sort of criteria, then it won't be classified as a bribe, but it'd still be a secret sort of commission, secret profit. You're still in the fraud category, but you don't get all these wonderful benefits that make life a lot easier for bringing a claim. So you still have to demonstrate loss, the breach of duty and loss that you normally do in any sort of litigation. Another sort of can of worms is if the agent is doing the bribing. That's much more complicated. It makes life much more difficult for the principal because the agent is the agent of the principal, and the case law on that is the principal, in order to avoid being held vicariously liable, has to demonstrate that the agent was on the fault of their own. Given that the worms that come out of that can, I'm not going to say much more on that one. So. What's the impact of all of this? I think the impact is if this were to happen, this is probably the quickest slide. Pretty obvious what the impact's going to be. Financial loss. If you're a victim of fraud, and then you've got the consequential costs of having to deal with someone like me, trying to chase down that fraud. Chasing down fraudsters is not the easiest thing in the world. You spend a lot of money on investigators, forensic accountants, forensic IT people, imaging, computers, etc., in the hope you find out where they've gone. There is also long-term repercussions, possibly reputational harm, etc., down to the business. Bribery is similar sort of losses, but there's also potentially criminal implications if you cannot demonstrate you've got procedures in place. How to spot it? So this is sort of countering through things that I've learned over the last however many years about how these, most frauds are pretty simple when you look at them in hindsight. And you see how the fraudsters got in, and you think, if only this had been done, and this person had taken the eye off the ball for a minute, and that's why this has happened. We're now in a world where everything is online. We email. We're attached to our emails. Our emails are accessible through absolutely every possible device we have. It makes life a lot easier for fraudsters. A lot of the tips that are listed there are centered around that business working practice. the basic principle is if something doesn't look right, it usually isn't. But the sort of things that we've noticed over the cases that we've worked on over time is things like most fraudsters don't do huge payments. They do lots of small payments in quick succession. So look out for things that, multiple invoices that don't necessarily look like they are attached to anything that you were expecting, for lots of small amounts over a short period of time. A big one is changes to bank details. What a lot of fraudsters do is they can hack into your, they have wonderful ways of getting into email inboxes, accessing Outlook 365. If you are using a web mail address, they are notoriously unsecure and very easy to hack. What they do is they hack into your inbox. I mean, they will profile you. They'll look online. They'll see where you work, what you do. They'll find your email address. They'll work out where you work. And it won't take them long to either hack your email account or set up an email address that is very similar to yours, but with a letter different. They work out what will sometimes happen is they work out where there's outstanding invoices owing. They send an email posing to be the person who's chasing for the invoice, and they'll say, just following up on this invoice, please let us know when you make payment. And by the way, we've changed our bank details. That gets people every time. Well, not every time, but a lot of the time, because you're running a business, you've got a lot to do. You know that looks legit. The email, you've got an unpaid invoice from this person, so you just want to pay it and get it done. That happens a lot. So look out for changing bank details. But even if they haven't changed their bank details, whenever you make an invoice, you should always call and verify the bank details. It's boring and it takes up time, but it's worth doing just to double check. But particularly if they've said they've changed their bank details. And if they have changed their bank details, don't call the number on the email that you've received. Use the number independent from that email. Google their business, use the number you usually use, because the whole email could be a scam. Check email addresses. Check there hasn't been like an odd letter added to that. Well, there's a big giveaway of a fraudulent email. Unusual language in email. Fraudsters will try and imitate the person's style of speaking. Sometimes it's obvious that it's not the person you usually deal with. Other things to look out for, frauds are often in accounts over a long period of time. So keep an eye on accounting errors. Is it happening a lot? Is there an explanation for the accounting error? So that's another way that if there's been, that's particularly relevant in internal employee frauds, if you have employees. Unusual invoices, payments going to and from third-party accounts. I think I've put on there as well. Again, it's if it looks odd, it probably is. Why are they asking us to pay this account that's seemingly unconnected to them? On bribery, so bribery's there. Well, bribery's a lot harder to spot because it's a secret. So you won't know someone been bribed until it's probably too late. But most humans slip up, so keep an eye on odd behaviour. How to prevent it. So these are a few tips that we tell clients to do. We do them ourselves sometimes. Know who you're dealing with. Do companies' house checks, obtain reference, third-party, independent references, run a search on them online. Credit reference agencies, a really useful tool, not particularly expensive. Check invoices before authorising payments. Verify payment details I mentioned, don't use the phone number that's on there. Dual verification processes when you do make payments is a really useful way to make sure that you've got checks and balances on payments going out. So if you've got more than one person that's got to sign off on a payment, that's a good way to sort of make sure there isn't anything untoward going on internally. I mentioned unsecure webmail. I would strongly advise against using Gmail, Hotmail, anything like that for anything, unless it's just emailing your family. Regular training on cybersecurity, on bribery, fraud, etc. If you have a business that has employees, is definitely worth doing. and independent audits as also worth doing, because it's a way of just making sure everything is okay in your accounts. And, use your instincts. If something smells, it probably is a problem. Bribery is similar, but with bribery, you've got the added complication of the Bribery Act. You need to make sure you have proper procedures in place. The government has published 6 key principles, which I've listed there. I'm not going to go through them, but they're there. What the government says should be in any internal policy on bribery. The whole purpose of it is, know your own business and produce a bribery policy that is adequate and tailored to your own business. I mean, the bribery policy for HSBC or something like that is not going to be the same for smaller businesses. Other things to do with reporting lines, make sure you have a clear reporting lines of communication and whistleblowing procedures if anyone wants. So someone feels they're in a safe space to raise an issue if they think there's a bribery issue. Other things that you can do, which you're probably already doing, or you can certainly speak to Steve, me and Jess about, is making sure that your agreements have suitable provisions in them dealing with complying with the businesses, the principles, bribery policies, and things like that. And there's obviously the extent you're cross-jurisdictional, which many of you will be. There's bribery laws everywhere. So you've got to know what the deal is in the local laws. How to tackle it? This is where I just speak to us. It's a self-serving slide. You need to act with fraud. You need to act quickly. Fraudsters don't steal loads of money and then leave it under their bed or leave it in an account somewhere for everyone to find. They move it around very quickly. They convert it, we talk about conversion, into other things. They make it difficult for it to be traced, and they disappear into jurisdictions that are impossible to get to them. So the quicker you move, the better. In the English court system is probably one of the best court systems in the world in terms of the tools it has available to enable you to act quickly, to shut things down if you can. There is a whole host of court orders you can obtain which are designed to stop. The English judges hate fraudsters. They really hate them, and they will arm you with the tools that you need to try and stop them as quickly as you can. And I've listed a number of the things there, and I'm sure you've heard about them, heard the name being floated around the press, but things like freezing injunctions. Freezing injunctions follow the defendant, they don't follow the asset. So and the idea of a freezer is to hold the ring. It's a ring fence the defendant's assets. So if you know who your defendant is, you know that they've nicked X amount of money. What you don't want them doing is disposing of all their assets. So it's all very well that you get a lovely judgment which says that you've won and you're entitled to this money. But if the defendant sold their houses and their cars and they're living in Puerto Rico somewhere, what good is that judgment? You're not going to be able to enforce it. So the idea of a freezer, and the reason why I get it right at the beginning, is if you think there's a risk of a defendant dissipating all of their assets, you hold the ring on their assets straight away. They have a freezer on their head. They can't touch their cash in their bank account until the case is over. So it enables you to have something to enforce against. Disclosure orders, it's when, in order to get disclosure very quickly, if you think, I know that you've done something, but you've hidden it from me, so I'm not sure exactly what it is. So, Judge, please can I have an order making this person give me all of these documents? Proprietary injunctions follow the property, so they follow the asset that's been taken, wherever it's gone around the world. And all of these orders, I mean, they're obviously UK jurisdiction limited, but if you have assets, if they're taking it out of the jurisdiction, what you would do is then seek to, what I call piggyback orders, is then get a similar order in that local jurisdiction, enabling you to enforce that order in that jurisdiction. Search orders are raiding people's property, like turning up at 8 a.m, banging on the door, raiding for, I mean, it's not quite like a police warrant, but it is effectively that. You go into their property and you have an order which provides what you can look for in that property, so you're limited to that. And there are lots of other funky orders that the English court can do. Passport orders, seizing passports, if you think someone's going to escape the jurisdiction to escape liability. Eavesdropping orders, third-party disclosure orders against non-parties. So lots of things that can be done. They are relief, they're not remedies. So you still need the underlying cause of action, which might be breach of contract, deceit, decisive, etc. And you probably will need an investigator. So it's not a cheap process. Bribery is still a type of fraud, so all of those interim relief measures will still be available. The interesting thing about civil bribery is you have far wider options or causes of action to bring a claim that you would do in a fraud case, for the special rules because of the special rules I explained earlier. But if you're suing the bribed agent or you're suing the briber, you're looking at things like even if you've recovered the bribe from the agent, you can still sue for account of profits, money had and received by the agent, a rescission of the contract that was entered into as a result of the bribe. You can bring proprietary claims on the basis a trust claim for the bribe itself, that is property belonging to the principal. So there's an impressive amount that can be done if you can demonstrate that there's been a bribe, and you don't have to account for the fact that you've already recovered the bribe itself. So that's it from me. I think the thing with 2 points, if you take anything away from that frantic canter, is be alert and speak to a lawyer. Yeah. Hello, that's Stuart.
Thank you. My name is Stuart Burns. I'm the founding partner of Fisher Forensic, which is a division of Asia Fisher LLP from Sharp Accountants. I have been involved with forensic accounting, litigation support over 35 years. I set up Fisher Forensic around about 30 years ago. I'm really involved with civil litigation matters, criminal work, but also intellectual property exploitation. So whenever IP rights are exploited through, say, license agreements or franchise agreements or joint venture arrangements, we audit in a non-confrontational manner the parties involved in order to determine if they've been under-reporting, and obviously settlement involved with that as well. So the talks tonight really on the effect, the uncertainties induced by certain global effects in terms of how that affects compensation calculations under commercial agents regulations. So at a time of uncertainty. So what are we trying to get hold of? What's the whole purpose of this exercise? So when an agent is terminated by a principal, the overriding position is that the agent is entitled to compensation, but not just for the loss of profits. It's also to charge into business it had with that particular principal. So it's very much akin to a third-party purchaser acquiring that business at the date of termination. What would a third-party purchaser pay for that business had it continued? So what is important to realize is that a valuation is not a fact. It's an estimate of the most probable outcomes that could have arisen had that business continued. And therefore, to a degree, there is some uncertainty, which I'll come on to later on in these slides. And I will set on that form, but if you ask 10 valuers to provide you with a valuation, you will get 10 different answers. And the reason why, not because they're doing it deliberately, not because they have entirely different views, but because they are having to make certain assumptions in the valuation process, which will differ slightly, and therefore have different outcomes. Hopefully the methodologies are going to be similar, and therefore there will be some general consensus, but there will be differences. And the valuer should be aware of applying a set process or formula. As businesses and circumstances all differ. Businesses are individual, they have individual circumstances, individual drivers, and also the underlying principle where the IP sits or the brand sits also have its own merits and demerits. And therefore each one is a separate matter in its own right. But ultimately, a valuation would be based upon a certain set of assumptions that the valuer has to assume. Let's look at some examples of very common examples of assumptions. Past performance, yeah? So you've got a track record there, several years of past performance, and there's a 10-year year-on-year growth, 10% year-on-year growth. Well, fine. It could be said, therefore, that you expect some degree of continued growth by the agent over a given time period going forward over the period of the valuation, not necessarily assumed in totality, but indicative. It could be that there's a step function with the agent. Perhaps the agent was allocated a new product or a new area, a new region, and was about to exploit that and was planning on doing so. And therefore, you'd expect, therefore, given the track record of the agent, maybe there's a step function of turnover, which means that they're even better than they were historically, actually factored into a valuation. Then there's our inherent assumption, for example, that the ability to trade and sell products internationally without impediment, in other words, seamless borders, which obviously, given Brexit, isn't necessarily an assumption you would make nowadays. And also continuing economic stability, again, an assumption may not necessarily exist now, but might have done for the historic trading that actually agent has evidence. So let's talk about the key elements in evaluation. Again, an example. First of all, the future value that this can generate discounted considerations of risk. So what we have is, we're trying to get at is, I suppose, the estimated future maintained earnings, which it can be assumed that the agent would have generated the year on year. But there's also a risk element involved. And that is, if, let's say, for example, a would-be purchaser would say, yep, I think there's a 7-year run on this business. Then obviously in year 7, that's more risky than year 1 because there's a fluctuation of time that takes place and therefore circumstances can change. Therefore you build in a discount to that year 7. Now if you build in a 10% discount per annum, working backwards to create what is known as a net present value, what that year 7 profit is worth today, 10% over 7 years knocks down that value by 50%. So, depending on the risk you import into that particular business and the discount rate you employ, can have a market effect on the present value of that business. And risk can be both individual to the firm, to the agency, and also risk to the general market of operation. So, in terms of the agency itself, there could be particular aspects of that agent that have some certain vulnerabilities to it. It may be, what Brian says in a minute, but in terms of the general market operation, it may be that there are supply chain issues in that market, maybe competition, perhaps product innovation, which means that previous products become somewhat out of fashion. So there could be both combinations working together when considering evaluation. So valuation uncertainty versus market risk. Valuation uncertainty really is where you have to come to a set of assumptions, but perhaps the influences of market forces and other circumstances mean that you can't necessarily provide definitive assumptions, and there may be some wiggle room in some areas of gray areas in those assumptions. That creates a valuation uncertainty. The other area, of course, is market risk, and our market risk can be equity risk, where, for example, you may have a comparator property company where you're comparing comparing the principal of the agent is a reflection of the principal, but you're comparing the principal of the business to a quoted equivalent, and you may find, therefore, that there's market fluctuations in that quoted equivalent. It could be there's commodity risk, so supply lines, availability, that type of thing, that could impact on that, and currency risk, currency fluctuations. Therefore, what actually turns out to be a sale turns out a lot less because it's discounted to currency fluctuations. So there's a market risk, so you have a combination of both. As far as the individual is concerned, there could be particular aspects of that which are peculiar to the agency. but it may also be important to remember that the agent is a reflection of the brand that it represents. And a strong brand means, therefore, that could be a good following for the agents as well, as on a piggyback type of arrangement. So some of the vulnerabilities of an agent could be that a reliance on a very narrow customer base. So you potentially losing one customer, is the agency profit could be downgraded significantly. On the contrary, again, a robust brand means that it could be a very vibrant and maintained business. Then there's the possibility of the agent to generate new leads. If he shows a mission to do that, it's something that could protect the agency going forward. And so you arrive at what is a multiplicand and the multiplier. Now, the multiplicand really is your estimated future maintained learnings, your base level learnings that become the springboard for the valuation. And the multiplier is really how many years purchase that involves, and hence the capitalization value. So, as well as the intrinsic factors that are built into both the agent individually and its principal individually, you also have the backdrop of third-party data. So you've got, for example, PERDA, which is an index with price-earnings ratio database. And what that does, it provides the information on completed private company deals, around about £20 million of value, normally that's the average size of those deals. And it provides historic account price-earnings ratios. That's interesting because our price-earnings ratio is basically the price that you were paid for that divided by the earnings. So it's part of the equation you'd use in terms of creating a valuation. Then you've got the UK 200 group. There are many other indices besides these ones, but these are ones to feature now. UK 200 group, and that's small and medium enterprise valuation index. Again, the enterprise value is interesting because what that does, it looks at all stakeholders in the business. So it's not just the equity interest, it's also the debt interest as well. So the totality of the enterprise itself. Again, the average size of that is a lot smaller at 6 million. Then you've got the BDO Private Company Index, and that's a database of enterprise value, as I said before, the totality value of the business divided by the EBITDA, which is earnings before interest, taxation, depreciation, and amortization. And what that's designed to do is that you may have structural differences with your entities you're looking at in terms of value, and it may have a high fixed asset capitalization. It may have carrying a large debt. What we want to desensitize the earnings profile to eliminate that structural inconsistency. And the way you do that is to eliminate interest, which is obviously indicative of debt, and depreciation and amortization, which is indicative of asset value, of assets carrying value. So that's why it's done on that basis. And then you have your comparative companies. So these are all the elements that a valuer would use in terms of determining the value of an entity under question, an agency in question. The comparative companies are often quoted companies that might be expected to provide data which is relevant to the evaluation. And these really are more following the principle rather than the agent, because the agent, I have said before, is a reflection of the principle. So if you're getting to know how viable and how good and how valuable the principle is, you're getting a reflection of the agency value attached to that. Industry indices, industry studies of the ONSC, Office of National Statistics, publish reports on retail sales trends, department stores. So this is all very good background information for valuation purposes. And market studies like the annual Ernst & Young and the EY luxury and cosmetics financial fact book that provides fashion brand earnings, multiples, growth rate. Again, these are all very good indicators, third-party reference points to use to carry out evaluation. So what are the impacts of Brexit, COVID, and the war in Ukraine? Well, one thing that is certainly the case is that there's market disruption. So it increases the valuation uncertainty and the risk applied to the valuation. And that can be obvious because the assumptions you've used, or you'd normally use, including past performance, track record, everything else, here's financial accounts, they were under a different environment, on different physical trading conditions. And therefore you have to factor in the kind of uncertainties that these challenging times present. And there's also going to be a risk applied to that valuation. Again, the discount rate, and that may increase because, trying to predict 5, 6, 7 years time becomes that more uncertain. And the second point there is so-called inputs and metrics available both for business and the wider market. Again, they're much less relevant because there's been the circumstances will have changed from the previous environment. So the valuation date becomes absolutely crucial. And if, for example, it's a perfect storm and it coincides with the economic or political crisis at hand, then you are in very uncertain valuation uncertainty principles, because you have really got a lot to go on. You've got a past performance, sure, you have an uncertain picture, and you haven't really got any recovery period even to look at. So you'd have to then factor in a number of different assumptions which should be regarded as being reasonable. They may be quite wide-ranging and provide a range of values in order for the parties to consider. And hopefully it's and certainly in effect under court of law, and to assist the court, I will provide with a range of values for the court to determine on the strength of the evidence given in the court case. Let's come to a conclusion on that. If it predates the occurrence, then it may be unaffected, because actually you're not supposed to use foresight, hindsight, and evaluation. So if you sold your business in December 2019 and it relied heavily on footfall, COVID comes along, but there's a delay in you sign the contract, there's a delay in enforcing or in actuating it, then you are entitled to the full amount of your consideration, unaffected by COVID, because it's done fine. Same thing with an agent. If an agent is terminated before an event, then unless it's foreseeable, then it shouldn't be taken into account in the valuation. And finally, in terms of post-Satan, the events, yes, that may be useful because you may be able to engineer or to financially model a recovery period and therefore a return to normality after the event that's taken place. But also you need to consider also in terms of the indices and quote companies on, it's surprising how quickly the markets react to a situation and already discounts quote companies, PEs and so forth for the events that are currently taking place. So just going to the various areas now, Brexit. So again, you have to examine, if you put a vote, you have to examine the specific impact. So luxury brands, for example, the foreign nationals coming to the UK can no longer retain the VAT. And if it means that there's a lesser market for that, the enters zero tariff, zero prices that we had originally within EU. Again, that creates difficulties, particularly headwinds to trade. In terms of fashion, according to the retail sector report, increased freight costs, increased customer costs, cancelled orders. Again, these are headwinds that are encountered. In consumer electronics, interestingly enough, for pan-European sales, previously you just had the EU CE mark, but now we have to have the UK CA mark, which means that there's another layer of complexity in order to roll out goods and make the sales of those products. In terms of the importation of goods, there could be double importation duties that are coming into the UK, going out of the UK, back into the EU, which creates a double effect. You can mitigate that through customs authorizations for inward-outward processing, but again, it's paperwork. There is unfortunately a bit of friction and breaking here because of the difficulty in engineering these things to take place. And again, applying the rules of origin of product, that was never a problem within the EU, obviously it becomes a problem now. And where goods are landed, it may be the structure you need to reorientate exactly how you format landing your goods to minimize the impact of duties and effective delays and so on. All this in reduced margins. Again, the indices will reflect these type of changes that occur. So that's to value to acknowledge in terms of how he approaches these so-called indices. But again, that's how Brexit can affect the valuation. Again, creating more uncertainty and a reduction in values. So COVID, loss of public footfall, obviously, the department stores suffered. Loss of number of high street retailers, and if as an agent, you represent those retailers, and suddenly you're losing your client base, which we call MAFIC. But to the contrary, enhance online shopping in a certain place. And if the agent represents brands that have a duality of routes of sale, which is basically through physical stores and also through online shopping, then maybe the brands and underlying shops customers will be adapting their models and their trading models, and the agent adapts with them, and they'll look to maintain, hopefully, the volume of sales through other means and through online purchases. So, and again, the indices will be indicative of the kind of effects. So again, there will be some adjustment to indices of third-party reference points. And finally, the war in Ukraine. So clearly, economic disruption. Again, depends on the nature of the goods and the extent of the effect of those goods. Some goods are amazingly unaffected. Others, we know, we've seen the price of the electricity driven up on the high street. Interestingly enough, consumer electronics. So you may or may not know this, but Odessa in Ukraine produces 70% of the world's neon gas, which is a key component in semiconductor production. So if you're waiting for your EV6 for a year or 2 years, this is probably the reason why, because the whole supply chain has been disrupted because of this, and therefore they do it to make sales. And of course there are the inflation and effect on disposable incomes for the public and the purchasing power. High-end or popular fashion, perhaps counterintuitively, maybe said that high-end brands may fare better only because the people who would buy high-end brands may be more well-heeled financially and therefore less affected by the economic squeeze. So really the takeaway from here, in summary, is that valuation is not necessarily an art form, but it's certainly sewing together a tapestry of individual influences that affect specific businesses, specific principles, the agency change relationship with principle, given all the what appears and said the other kind of said here before, to do with that, but also to do with the circumstances, the global impact of uncertainty. And the value obviously will be tasked to be able to cultivate an overall picture which embraces all of this, but that's part of the challenge and part of the story. Thank you.
Hi everyone, as Steve said, I'm an associate in the Commerce and Technology Department here at Fox Williams, and I'm also part of the agent law team. And I'll be swapping our research changes to the law around online selling and the potential consequences of non-compliance, the suppliers and principles in this particular. Now, the starting point when talking about selling online in respect of vertical agreements is to consider the vertical block exemption regulation, or the VBER, and the vertical agreements block exemption order, the VBEO. And the reason for the two is Brexit. By vertical agreements, I mean agreements entered into by businesses operating at different levels of the supply chain, for example, supplier and distributor. And I'm sure that these are two acronyms that you're all familiar with, but just by way of a brief introduction. During the Brexit transition period, the UK retained the previous version of the EU VBER. However, this expired on the 31st of May 2022. Now, the Competition and Markets Authority, or the CMA, proposed that the UK should have a separate regime specifically tailored to the needs of UK businesses and UK consumers. The UK VBEO, which I will refer to as the UK order, came into force on the 1st of June 2022. And on the same day, the revised EU VBER, which I'll refer to as the EU regulation, also came into force. Now, it's important to note that those doing businesses in both the UK and the EU should be aware that there are now two separate regimes. Any agreements concluded after the 31st of May 2022 will be covered by the new rules. However, both the EU regulation and the UK order provide for a 1-year transition period. Therefore, any vertical agreements which existed before the 1st of June 2022 and which met the conditions for exemption under the previous rules will now have until the 31st of May this year to be compliant with the new rules. The concept and structure of the new rules remains largely the same as the previous version of the EU regulation. By way of a reminder,
Where a vertical agreement meets the conditions of a block exemption, it will not be prohibited under competition law. In the next 10 minutes or so, you'll hear me refer to hardcore and excluded restrictions. Any agreement that contains hardcore restrictions will make the entire agreement fall out of the safe harbor. However, where there are excluded restrictions, it is only the specific clause which will not benefit from the block exemption and which will need to be assessed on an individual basis. The remainder of the agreement will continue to benefit from the block exemption, provided that the excluded restriction is capable of being severed from the rest of the agreement. And this applies to both the EU and UK regimes. So ultimately, the key principle in both EU and UK competition law is that it prohibits agreements that prevent, restrict, or distort competition in the market to the detriment of consumers. And the purpose of these rules is to ensure that businesses do not use vertical agreements in anti-competitive ways. So where does online selling come into all of this? There are significant changes under the new rules, and the safe harbour from infringing competition law has been readjusted for certain types of vertical agreements to take into account recent developments, such as the development of online selling, which I will be focusing on. Restricting a buyer, be it a distributor or retailer, in some way down the supply chain is often a key objective for suppliers of goods or services. The restriction must be compliant with existing UK and EU competition laws, otherwise the restriction will be unenforceable, the contract containing the restriction may also be unenforceable, and penalties may also be imposed by the UK's Competition and Markets Authority or by the EU Commission. Therefore, it's important to know what these competition rules are to ensure that you don't fall foul of them. And I've listed some of the key changes on the slide, however, I will be focusing on the top 4: active and passive selling, parity obligations, dual pricing, and online sales restrictions, as these specifically relate to online selling. I'll also be highlighting where the EU regulation and the UK order diverge from one another. So active or passive selling. What is active selling? This is where distributors actively approach and target a specific customer group or customers in a specific territory. And this could be through direct mail, sending unsolicited emails, or targeted advertising. Passive selling, on the other hand, is where distributors respond to unsolicited requests from individual customers without having initiated the sales by means of actively targeting those customers. Now, the general rule is that suppliers can, in certain situations, prevent their distributors from actively selling to a specific customer group or customers in specific territories which are allocated to other distributors. However, in general, suppliers cannot prevent passive selling. Now, by way of an example, if the supplier has 2 exclusive distributors, one in the UK and one in Spain, the supplier can prevent their UK distributor from actively selling into Spain and vice versa. However, if a Spanish customer contacted the UK distributor without having been solicited, this would constitute passive selling and would be allowed. Both the new UK order and EU regulation provides clarity on the definition of active and passive sales with regards to operating websites. So the operation of a website is a form of passive selling. However, the new rules state that it will constitute active selling if the website offers languages that are not commonly used in the territory where the distributor is established. If I use my previous example, if the UK distributor's website had a Spanish language option, this would be active selling at prospective Spanish customers, as it indicates that the UK distributor is targeting a geographical area in which that language is used. Another way that operating a website could be considered active selling is if the website has a top-level domain name corresponding to a geographical area other than the one in which the distributor is established. By that I mean, if the UK distributor's domain name ended in .es, that's the geographic domain extension to Spain. The next key change to be aware of is parity obligations. Now, these are sometimes called most favoured nation clauses, or MFNs, and there's a distinction between wide and narrow MFNs. So wide MFN clauses seek to prevent a supplier from offering goods or services on better terms on any platform, on any other platform or sales channel, to the extent that these clauses apply to retail agreements. An example of this would be where a supplier is prevented from offering its goods or services on better terms on any other sales channel than on a price comparison website. By contrast, narrow MFNs impose pricing restrictions on the supplier's direct route to market, so their own website. For example, a clause which prevents a hotel from offering better terms on its own website than on a particular booking platform would be a narrow MFN. Now, these terms don't necessarily only have to concern price, but they could also be in relation to inventory or availability. Under the UK border, wide MFNs are treated as hardcore restrictions, and even narrow ones may be subject to review by the CMA. However, this represents a point of divergence with the EU regulation, which does not classify wide MFNs as hardcore restrictions, and therefore they are not automatically prohibited. Wide MFNs imposed on suppliers by online platforms are excluded restrictions under the EU regulation. And as previously mentioned, this means that they are excluded from the automatic benefit of the safe harbour, and the provision, rather than the agreement as a whole, will require individual assessments. Now, a specific point to note is that the EU measure specifically targets online intermediation services, whilst the UK order does not restrict itself in this way and applies to both online and offline sales. So moving on to dual pricing. This is where the same distributor is charged different prices for products intended to be sold online and products sold offline. The previous EU regulation treated dual pricing as a hardcore restriction, but the new rules for both the UK and EU adopt a more flexible approach, largely due to the growth of the internet, and online sales have been recognised by both the CMA and the Commission as justification for adjusting the safe harbour, permitting dual pricing. So as I said, dual pricing is no longer a hardcore restriction, which means that suppliers can now set different wholesale prices for online and offline sales by the same distributor without automatically falling outside the blanket exemption safe harbour, and this applies to all suppliers irrespective of their distribution model. Although the EU regulation adopts the same approach, it makes it conditional on the supplier satisfying additional requirements. For example, price differences must be related to the differences in costs incurred by the distributors in each channel, whether online or offline, but the parties are not required to carry out complex cost calculations. So on the slide, you'll see a non-exhaustive list of examples of both hardcore restrictions and restrictions that would fall within the safe harbour of the block exemption. I'm not going to go through all of these, I'm conscious of time, and I think you'll have a copy of the slides. When I talk about online restrictions, I'm referring to the supplier's ability to restrict the buyer or distributor, and likewise, a principal's ability to instruct agents not to deal with certain customers. However, please note that online sales restrictions are only permissible if the restriction does not prevent the effective use of the internet. So the first example is the most straightforward example of a hardcore restriction. So it is a hardcore restriction to directly prohibit a buyer to use the internet to sell the goods and services. Another hardcore restriction would be if an agreement contains a provision prohibiting the buyer from using an entire online advertising channel, such as search engines or digital comparison tools. This also includes any restriction which indirectly prohibits the use of an entire online advertising channel, such as a restriction on the distributor to provide price-related information to a price comparison site. However, as you can see in the second column, prohibiting the use of particular online marketplaces is generally not a hardcore restriction, as it does not restrict sales to a particular territory or customer group, given that other online sales channels remain available to the buyer, such as the buyer's own online store. For example, a supplier of luxury goods could instruct a distributor not to sell through online marketplaces to protect the brand's image. So contrary to these hardcore restrictions, certain requirements can be imposed by the supplier on the buyer relating to the manner in which the goods and services can be sold, which will benefit from the exemption. For example, a requirement that the buyer must operate at least one physical store, or the supplier may also impose requirements relating to the presentation of the product, whether this is the minimum number of products of the brand to be displayed or the minimum amount of space between the products on the online store. And to summarize, I've set out some of the key take-home points. Sorry, that was a bit of a whistle-stop tour with conscious of the time. So the new rules and guidelines offer helpful and practical examples of how distribution agreements can be shaped. And depending on the terms of your agreement, any vertical agreements concluded before the 1st of June 2022 may need to be terminated or varied to comply with the new rules. This provides an opportunity for suppliers to restructure their distribution networks, given the more lenient approach to certain practices regarding online sales. However, there may be uncertainty in applying the rules practically, given that in some cases there is now the requirement to undertake a case-by-case assessment. And a final point to note, which I think probably the most important, is that for those doing businesses in both the UK and EU, it's important to remember that there are now two separate regimes, so you may need to check agreements to ensure that they're compliant with both regimes, as otherwise they may be unenforceable. I'll hand back to Steve.
Thank you very much, Jess, and thank you to all the speakers. Now, the opportunity to turn the tables. Are there any questions from the floor? Yes.
I just want on the valuation period. So I understood the process that you have to go through when you're valuing, taking everything into consideration. What's the period of time? Is it differ per country that you have to, are you getting 2 years assessment of what the business has been, or 5 years, or 1 year?
So in terms of to create a valuation, you're looking back over 3, 4, 5 years of that business. You may actually weighted average those because the more recent years are more reflective of the current nature of that business. So you'll give more weight to the later years in that historic profile. And that's used, and that may well be the basis of your evaluation. I mean, clearly, maybe other circumstances, you may want to then establish, as I said in the presentation, and let's maintain learnings to best to harvest it from that information and from other circumstances that exist in the marketplace. So that's how it's normally done, that structure. And in terms of number of years forward, that really is a question of the value of that agency, underpinned by the value of the principal. So the longevity of that, in other words, how many years purchase, those really are governed by the parameters I've discussed earlier, which is, for example, if it's the equivalent company, what kind of P ratio that would have. That may be they do 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, discounted back for the factors of a private company as a quality company. They never had vulnerabilities. A quality company else can be different from a private company because there is a less market penetration, less market capitalization, less staff, less widely construed business, and so on. So that's how it's done. That answer a question.
But can an agent expect 2 years compensation?
So
that 5 years?
Yeah. So the wrong method I get here is that the how many years you value, it depends on the price earnings ratio determined that agency should have. So for example, let's an example, another example. Let's example, you've got a quality company that's got where the principal, which is therefore what you're trying to look at, because the agent is a reflection of the products of the principal. If the principal is similar to a quality company with, say, a P ratio, say, 15, that's that means 15 years worth of earnings in the future. It may well be when you come to the private company equivalent, because of the vulnerabilities a private company has in relation to a public company, less critical mass and so on, you then employ discounts to that P ratio, knock it down to, say, 5, 6, 7, 8, who knows? I mean, depending on, each one has to be evaluated in the context of the available information you have to hand for the market in which that agent operates. And again, look at the indices I've mentioned on the screen before, those third-party indices that can be indicated in value. And once you have that, determine that PE, that's the PE you apply, that's the multiplier, i.e. number of years, you apply to that maintained learning of that multiple can to arrive at your value.
So that changed, does it? Because it used to be fairly simple, didn't it? It was like indemnity and compensation. It seems to have got much wider.
No.
No?
Let me, if I may, just follow on from Stuart and have to address that point, and also where I anticipate the question of the back was going. What we have been considering this evening, more particularly what Stuart has been focusing on, has been the concept of compensation payable to a terminated agent. But of course, and I did say before that we have a complex world before us. it is the case that there can be compensation paid to a terminated agent, or the agent can have an entitlement to indemnity. Some countries will operate by reference to compensation, some countries will operate by reference to indemnity, and some countries will operate by reference to both. And that is not simply within the European Union, not simply within the United Kingdom. The idea that agents should be entitled to some form of protection applies in a variety of countries around the world. South Korea is a prime example, the UAE another example, Brazil, Colombia in South America, and indeed, probably a reflection of me, if nothing else. On my train in this morning, I was reading a paper by an Israeli lawyer who was going through the application of the Israeli Agency Act and how that provides for compensation payable to a terminated agent. And the idea that there is some formula that applies, as Stuart said, when it comes to compensation, it's more of an art than a science. There are certain things that you can look at, certain things that Stuart and his colleagues, I know, do look at. But if you're looking for an easy and ready formula, something in terms of available on a YouTube video, unfortunately, it doesn't exist when we come to compensation, and really, it barely exists when we're talking about indemnity, although arguably, because of the parameters that apply to indemnity and the fact that it is subject to a cap, means that it is possibly a bit easier to calculate and to negotiate where one is in that situation. Any other questions? Yes.
Another on that one. Are we able to cap the number of years then in the contract between principal and agent? So, i.e., so it's not completely uncapped. So you just say, here's your factor, we're going to pay for 15 years or 1 year or two, whatever. That's question number one. Question number two is you focused on the negative impacts of COVID and moving forwards. Well, we're depreciating. Because Brexit and COVID is now over, many agents may argue they're actually now on recovery. So is actually sales now going to go up? So rather than a depreciation of valuation, it's actually an inflation of valuation because we're now recovering. Yeah. Therefore, you can look back to how they were performing in 2018-19 and then say, okay, I've performed really poorly over the last 2 years. However, in 2 years' time, I'm intending and investing back in my business and growing back up to it. Therefore, you're hitting a much bigger number of matches of delivery.
No, so absolutely right. And I just following from that, I mentioned that the timing of the events of valuation is crucial. But if you're at the eye of the storm, and if we don't know how long shows our last for, then where is the recovery? But I did say that if it post-dates, then you can look at a recovery profile back to normal trading. And I absolutely agree with that. And even in COVID, there are those businesses that would do better to go with because the purchase haven't COVID. So yeah, it's much more widely construed consideration. But yes, I agree with you 100% that recovery is something which is absolutely part of the ingredients of evaluation. As far as capping is concerned, normally in terms of if it's absent indemnity, which is what Stephen is referring to, if indemnity is mandated for as the basis of valuation, then there are automatic caps in there in any event. And it's quite a rigid formula, and as Stephen said, it's quite easy to apply. It's clearly, we're still evaluating the profitabilities and so forth, but you're not into the areas of P ratios and multipliers because that doesn't apply in the indemnity position. But that has to be carved out within the agreement, special clause, to go down that channel. But as far as capping in a normal valuation scenario, no, that's going to be governed by the external parameters that refer to as indices and the comparators and so on in order to determine what that PE should be.
Okay. Without wishing to add insult to injury, if you do put a cap in and the agent is entitled to compensation, that cap will turn out to be unenforceable.
So it's a signed agreement saying, if we terminate, we will pay you 2 years worth of fees. They may turn around and say, that's unenforceable, we'll take 10.
They may take the 2 and then sue you for the balance.
So would the sales agency agreement have to specify indemnity on termination or compensation? What about if it doesn't specify that?
To come within the term used in a complete different context by Jess, to come within the safe harbour of indemnity, there must be an election for indemnity. The parties must choose indemnity at the outset.
Jessica, can I ask you, on the EU and UK, is the CMA quite strict in terms of retail pricing? Is there any difference in the EU? So let's say I had a UK customer that was selling into Europe. Is it the same application on retail pricing? Could they fix their retail pricing?
The price at which the buyer resells?
Yeah. Not allowed to in the UK.
Jess, do you want to tackle that or want me to respond?
I think you're better placed.
If you fix the buyer's resale price in this country, you may well find yourself at Her Majesty's pleasure.
Yeah. Well, I'm saying
that's the good news. The bad news is I make a visit. In terms of the EU, the same scenario exists, but without going inside. But important to the scenario exists. Having said that, there will be the laws of some countries, some member states of the EU, where if you engage in fixing resale prices, then certain things may happen.
We ever allowed to have MAP like the US?
There has been discussion in the run-up to the coming into force of the BAPEO that Jess referred to. There was consideration of MAP so far as the UK was concerned. My own view is that was a concept too far for the UK government. Yes.
What does MAP? A minimum established price?
Yes. Yes, and in certain circumstances it is allowed in the United States and the US laws. Okay, then, and then I think we do need to adjourn. Then,
I'm sure it's also that all of us would be interested to hear of Foxwoods and your opinion. There's to be a bonfire of laws in this country that emanated from the European Union. The commercial agents regulations, in Foxwoods' opinion, will be reinstated in this country, and if so, if that's the case, would it be in anyone's interest then to have contracts within the European Union or within this country? Because if there's not going to be a commercial agents regulations in this country that mirrors that which exists at this present time for the EU, maybe it's in everyone's interest to have European EU-based contracts where we can all benefit from that which exists at this time. Regrettably, though, it will not be possible for Foxwoods to assist us, as you all have done for many years and very successfully, and we shall have to deal with European lawyers in some foreign language. Do I really want to go there? No.
Mm-hmm. There are a number of issues that you've raised there. I'll just touch on two. The first issue is, as I mentioned at the outset of the seminar, two recent Court of Justice, that is European Court decisions, of course, us as the team and our colleagues in the movement team who are not speaking this evening, to have to think about how the judgments of the European Court apply in a post-Brexit world, because they are not part of the EU retained law, so far as the law of the United Kingdom is concerned. That's one point. The second point is a very personal point, and that is that the proposed legislation to enable the government to decide which parts of EU retained law will survive or not survive is, in my personal view, an absolute affront to the rule of law. And my hope is that the House of Lords will act in such a way as to prevent that particular bill becoming law.
Thank you.
That is a very personal view, and I recognise it as a view that may not be shared both within this forum and elsewhere. I'd like to thank you for attending. I would like to thank our speakers for speaking, and if you would join me in the usual way in thanking them, and then if you could, please adjourn across the corridor, and we shall have some drinks and canapes and some, hopefully, good conversations. So thank you.